Hi, kinesiology students. We're continuing to look at planes and movements here, and we're going to talk about the next plane, which is the frontal plane. The frontal plane divides the body up into anterior and posterior halves. So if I was to stand sideways to you like this and put an imaginary line right here through my shoulder all the way down, that would divide me into anterior and posterior halves. So that is the frontal plane. So if I was to move in the frontal plane, right, I'd be doing like stuff like this, like a jumping jack, that sort of thing, or a cartwheel I could do purely in the frontal plane. But the plane would be this way going through me, and so that's where my movements would be occurring. So what are the movements in the frontal plane? Well, two of the most important ones are abduction and adduction. Okay, this is a tricky one because they sound so similar. Abduction. Abduction is any movement of the body away from the midline. Remember that midline, that imaginary line that goes through our body, copies the sagittal plane. Any movement away from the midline is abduction. So the way helps me to remember this is, where do we hear the word abduction in our world? We usually hear about aliens. Alien abduction, right? What do the aliens do when they abduct you? They take you away, right? So same thing. Abduction is away from the midline. So I just showed you an obvious one, the shoulder. So if I abduct at the shoulder, I am moving away from the midline. If I abduct at the wrist, I am moving away from the midline. If I abduct at the hip, I am moving away from the midline. Okay, so that is what we call abduction. Adduction is the opposite. It's moving closer to the midline. So adduction is going towards the midline of the body. So when I think of adduction, I think if I add to my midline, right? I add to my middle, I'm getting a little bit more adipose tissue on me. I add to my middle, I add to the midline. So that's adduction. So adduction at the shoulder looks like this. Adduction at the wrist, at the hip. This is adduction right here at the hip. And I can do it at the fingers as well, right? So I can abduct and then adduct at the fingers too. So that's abduction and adduction. Really have to think through that one to help you remember it. Remember, aliens and getting bigger in the midline, adding to your midline. Okay, next one, elevation and depression. Elevation and depression are basically, they're smaller movements, but it's going up. So any movement that's going really superior, directly superior, is elevation. So let me show you an example. At the shoulders, elevation looks like this. Okay, so a straight up, straight superior movement. This would be elevation at the shoulder. I can also elevate at the jaw, right? So those are two common examples of elevation. Depression is the opposite. So when I depress at my shoulders, I've already got my shoulders shrugged, and then I depress my shoulders straight down, straight inferior. Or if I depress my jaw, if I depress my jaw, looks like that, right? I open my mouth. So elevation, depression, straight up and down movement. Not really that common, but it is a movement in the frontal plane. Inversion E-Version. These are special movements. The ankle, for whatever reason, gets the special treatment in anatomy. These are special movements that only occur at the ankle. Okay, so inversion E-Version. And if you've ever had a sprain before, an ankle sprain, a lot of us have, you maybe have heard these terms The first inversion is if you were to turn the more distal part of your foot, the plantar side, the bottom of your foot, in towards the midline, that would be inversion. So let me show you at the ankle here. Okay, this is inverting at the ankle. As you can imagine, about 90% of all ankle sprains are inversion sprains. Is that rolling of the ankle, spraining the ankle, and it's on that more lateral side, which means it's an inversion sprain. That bottom of your foot closer to the midline, that's inversion. Eversion is the opposite. Eversion is pointing the bottom of your foot, that most distal part of your foot, to away from the midline, right? More lateral. So eversion looks like this. Eversion. It's not as common a movement. Not like only about 10% of our ankle sprains are eversion sprains. They're pretty bad though if they're an eversion sprain. But eversion is that pointing out, and if you're using your fibularis longus muscle, that is really how you evert at the ankle. So inversion, bottom of the foot in towards the midline. Eversion, bottom of the foot away from the midline. The last one in the frontal plane is lateral bending. And that's really kind of a special movement that we do at our torso, at the spine. So if I was going to lateral bend, it would be like this. Lateral bend to the left or to the right. That would be what we consider to be lateral bending. Okay, that's it. And we are going to be looking at the next plane and movements pretty soon. See you then.